Scott, Glenn, when you joined the Leftovers a few years ago now, what were you expecting, and did it live up to your expectations?
Well, the first thing I'm thinking about, because it was the first time I ever Skyped in my life, was when Damon called me up. I was in my home in Idaho, and he called me up to try to convince me to be in the Leftovers. And his opening line was, "I understand you hate television, and I want you to be in this show." And I said, "Who gave you that idea that I hate television?" And then he said, "Well, JJ." And I remember I had lunch with JJ Abrams I think three times, where he was tried to convince me to play a part in Lost. And I turned it down, not because I didn't want to work with him or do Lost, but I didn't want to be stuck in Hawaii, not really knowing how big the part was going to wind up being. And Arthur Miller had written a small part in a play for me that they were doing at the Goodman Theater in Chicago. So that was the reason I didn't do it. I asked Damon about what it was that he was doing. He told me about the book, and that it's sort of what happens with the world after the trauma of losing 2% of its population all at the same time. And one of the things he said to me was, he said that he believed that in great traumas, floods, plagues, pestilence, war, if the trauma is great enough, that's when prophets spring up and people need something to hang on to. And he said, as far as he was concerned, there were basically three kinds of prophets. There were crazy people who were just wounded by the trauma. That would be the guilty remnant. There are false prophets, evil prophets. That would be Wayne, who just want power, sex, money, and use that traumatic experience to get people to give them whatever they wanted. He said, and then real prophets. And I said, and who would that be? And he said, that would be you. And I said, well, give me an example of some other real prophets. He said, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha. I said, which one of those am I? And he said, you're none of them. Probably closer to Moses than anyone. And his original deal with me was, he said, HBO is going nuts because I'm willing to have you come to New York and work without a contract, which means I could have just in the middle of shooting got up and left, and that would have been it. And he said, you see, you may hate doing this. If you do, then leave. I may think you really suck doing this, at which point I'm going to ask you to leave. Or it could work out really well. And it worked out really well. We did the first season. I remember he also said to me at the time, this in retrospect, makes me realize how smart and also deviant he is. He said, oh yeah, he said, I think sometime in the future your character is going to go on some kind of a walkabout. And then he dropped it. So we did season 1, which I was in a fair amount of time as a guest. Season 2, I was hardly in at all. I worked 2 days, and one of them was on a television screen from Perth, where you could hardly see me at all. And and then in season 3, he said, I'm basically going to be a regular on the show. Excuse me. In one episode, the 3rd episode, he said, we'll be pretty much a standalone, senior only deal, in which I, in fact, will go on a walkabout. So that's the way that.
It's pretty incredible. And you're talking obviously about crazy Whitefella thinking. And I got to say, for people who love this show and love your character, it was a blessing to have this episode where you do go walkabout, quite literally in the all over Australia. What was your initial reaction to when you got that script?
I shouted for joy. It was it remains one of the, if not my favorite script I've ever worked on. And before I got the script, I was in Idaho, and Damon had told me a bit about what I was going to be doing. And I said, how do I prepare for this? And he said, he sent me a book, Bruce Chatwin's Songlines. He gave me some films to watch, the main one of which was Peter Weir's The Last Wave. And then to sort of see what the countryside looked like around Broken Hill, Wake and Fright. He said, get a didgeridoo, try to learn to play it. I'm going to send you tapes of indigenous language and indigenous singing. If you can learn some of these songs, try to learn the rhythms. A friend of mine who lives next door to me in Idaho also loves Australia, and he knows quite a bit about it and spent a lot of time there. And he told me, he said, do you know Walkabout? And I said, yeah. And he said, do you know a film called Charlie's Country? And I said, no. And he said, well, you really ought to watch it. It's the same actor years later. And before I got this job, I knew nothing about the tribal people of Australia. I soon found out that it's the oldest continuing single civilization on the planet by a lot.
Yeah.
Was it like sort of typically the two religions that fight over which one is the oldest is Judaism and Hinduism. Is it the Vedic texts or the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, those people are, that argument is give or take a nickel and a dime around 7,000 to 8,000 years. The tribal people of Australia have had a continuing civilization, as you probably know, for 150 fucking thousand years.
Yeah.
And these are people that discovered agriculture 40,000 years ago and rejected it, because if you become a farmer, you have to stay in one place. And being a nomad and constantly walking the song lines is, from their perspective, what human beings were meant to do. So I sort of, even before I got to Australia, oddly fell in love with that culture. And then, well, we were supposed to spend at least a week and a half in Melbourne before we went on location. But because it was just the way the movies and television work, we got to Melbourne, and a day later we were on a plane to Broken Hill. And the afternoon we arrived in Broken Hill, I was in a high school gymnasium singing and dancing with indigenous people. I just loved the whole thing. But the script was one of the few times in my life where the script just played me. And I realized that when I woke up, the second day of shooting was a long 7-page scene with David. And I remember saying out loud, I woke up in the morning and I said, Scott, your job today is to not let yourself get in the way of what's going to happen. Don't try to make anything. Don't try to be funny. Don't try to be powerful. Don't try to make moments work. Just dive in and see where it takes you. And especially that entire episode basically played me. And that's only happened to me 2 other times in my life. And I've been doing this for over 45 years.
Yeah. It's amazing. And, I can't begin to tell you how important this episode is to someone like me who is Australian, and I've never seen our Indigenous culture represented so beautifully and authentically, especially on American television. It means a lot. And the way that you and David Gulpilil, who you referenced earlier, who's one of our greatest actors ever, just seem to work so seamlessly. Talk us through the process of meeting with him and working through those scenes with him.
When I got the script, I learned it like an actor would learn a play. So I knew it backwards and forwards, and I knew that those 7 pages completely. And then I promptly forgot them all. And I don't know if you know David or if you've spent any time around him, but he's something about his vibe that is just captivating. And when we met, my opening lines are in the language of one of the tribes. And I introduced myself to him in the language, and David himself grabbed me and hugged me, and he said, "Well done, brother, well done. That's beautiful." And there was something about the way that he said that just gave me a permission to really just dive into the life of that scene and that whole episode without predetermining anything. So I guess the feeling of being with someone like that is a feeling of artistic safety. Like you really can't fuck it up. That if you're following your heart and your impulses with someone like David, it can't be wrong. And so we did take after take. I couldn't remember what I'd done in any of the takes. And Mimi Lee, the director, at a certain point, she said, "Scott, you really don't remember any of this stuff, do you?" I said, "No." She said, "You don't remember crying when you picked up the tape recorder?" I said, "No." I remember looking into David's eyes and talking, but I don't really remember the specifics. And she said, "Would you be willing we'd done I think it was 3 takes. She said, "Would you be willing now to take a part of your consciousness and get back into the scene and watch yourself a little bit? Because if you can't direct you, I can't direct you. No one can. Would you be willing to do that?" And I said, "No, I'm not willing to do that." Artists live their whole life waiting for something like this to happen. It's only happened to me twice before in my life where a part has played me. And no. And so Mimi said, "Well, if I'm not getting something I want, what do you suggest we do?" And I said, "More takes." "That'll exhaust you." And I said, "No, it won't. It absolutely will not." And that's the way we did the whole episode.
I think I can only imagine that you would have gone through a lot in this process of making this episode, because Kevin Sr. Is almost at death's door, and it just feels very authentic to us as the audience. Would you say that there are any parts of that episode, especially towards the end, before you get to the ranch house, if that's what you want to call it, that were just really physically so challenging for you?
I didn't realize, but that until I got into it, what it would be to spend 3 weeks every day with a broken leg, essentially dragging my left leg. My right leg behind me. When we got back to Melbourne, my left leg was not only stronger but noticeably bigger than my right leg. So that alone, just on crutches, dragging myself around the outback, and working with. It was the first time I had ever been photographed by a drone, so which meant that a lot of those takes, I really was physically out of sight of the crew or anyone.
Yeah,
I just kept letting me keep walking and walking. I thought, they said a drone will pick you up sooner or later, and I remember at a certain point they said I had a electronic thing in my ear, and they said, "Well, okay, Scott, the drone is coming. Get ready. Okay, action." And I heard like a little bee sound that get louder and louder. And at one point, I remember feeling this something behind me as the drone came that close to my head, spun around, obviously came in for some kind of a close-up, and then disappeared. And then I saw what it was, just taking long shots. That was hard. But it was it's interesting. It was both hard and but so much fun and so rewarding, and such a sort of powerful and emotional and spiritual experience that would always overrode the physical part of it. I remember one point when I have a scene with the snake. I walked right almost up to the snake at one point. And the snake handler said something to Mimi. She said, "Scott, freeze." I stopped, and the snake handler got the snake and put it in the bag, and then they had a plexiglass shield that they then put up, and I went over to Mimi. I said, "Well, what happened?" She said, "Well, the snake handler told me that these snakes, it was a brown snake, that Australian brown snakes don't like a lot of movement, and the snake conceivably could have come after me." And, so I said to the snake handler, I said, "Well, there's a helicopter here and you've got anti-venom. I guess if the thing had bit me, it would have been bad, but I would have survived." And he said, "All of this is window dressing." He said, "This is the second most venomous creature on the face of God's earth. Probably had about 5 minutes to live."
Yeah.
I didn't get close to the brown snake ever again.
I'm so glad to hear it, because we always say Australia is trying to kill you. I always tell my kids, if you see a brown snake, you must run. Just run. Something that we're brought up knowing. It's fascinating that happened to you. Thinking of episode 3 and the series at large, the writing is always so beloved and talked about. But I'd like to focus on the direction of, especially by Mimi Leader. She directed your episode. She really brings so much to this, doesn't she? I'm going to speak to her later today, and I'm going to ask her a lot about this episode. But what do you think particularly she brings to this show that no one else does?
She gave me a compliment, and I'm going to turn it around on her. She said after the first day of working and going into the second day, she said, "Scott, you always go to the deep end and you go there right away." Well, what Mimi did for me was, once I was in the deep end, kept me there and intensified it. And she did it in a million different ways. She did it by just saying one word to me, or saying nothing. "Let's go again," or and I think I can say this, even though it's probably. I mean, at one point, we were getting ready to shoot the section where I take off all my clothes, paint myself and take clap sticks and steal a song and dance in a sacred place. And when we went over there, I didn't realize that our summer is in fact your guys' winter. So It was fucking cold out there. Yeah. Like in the 30s cold.
Yeah, it's freezing.
Yeah, it was like wicked. And she said, so we're going to have probably about 70 people, cast, crew, everyone standing around at night. So, so you're going to be taking all your clothes off in front of these people and then singing and dancing. Is there anything I can do to help you? And I said, offhanded, not really meaning it, I said, yeah, have a bottle of DJ 1942 in my dressing room. She said, what's that? I said, that's a tequila, Don Julio, 1942. And I kind of said that because it's one of the best tequilas in the world and almost impossible to get outside of Mexico. And so lo and behold, I get there that night, and in my dressing room on the table is a big presentation bottle of Don Julio, 1942. I had Mimi come, we passed it around. She'll do anything to get the performance she wants. I love Mimi. She's as good or better than any director I've ever worked with. And if I have any sadness about this show coming to an end, it's not working with her and Damon again, together or separately, because they're both what a privilege. What an incredible gift those two have given me.
Yeah, I hope they work together again because we're going to miss that combination, and they're just insanely good, insanely good. Do you can you say whether the series finale satisfied you, what you were hoping for it?
The last show,
Yeah,
I haven't seen it.
you haven't seen it. No one has, I think.
I read the
They're all
script.
waiting.
I
You've
read
read
this. Yeah, it satisfies me. But my sense of the show has always been that the value of the show is not so much answering questions, but getting the audience at the end to ask themselves those questions in a deep and personal way. So if, at the end of the show, you really are asking yourself, what does it mean when I say the word family? What's that really mean? And and also, what's the origin of spirituality or religion? Why do you need? What is it that impels us to need a reason to get up in the morning beyond our own momentary survival or collection of pleasures?
Yeah.
So for me, yeah, the whole show is very satisfying. You know, I kind of like thinking about, with those who survive, who are still alive, what they've gone on to do. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I play such an irreverent, proactive, oddly different character than almost anyone in the show. Not a moment of whining, not a moment of feeling sorry for myself. And I'm thinking, as senior, you know, obviously the heavy rains have come and gone, but there was no flood, and all of the signs I saw. Where am I going now? What am I going to wind up doing? And I have no idea. Probably still in Australia, riding around with an outlaw motorcycle club.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like
You mentioned that there are two other roles that played you. What are they?
a film I did many years ago called Urban Cowboy,
Yeah.
and a play that I did for about 6 months here in New York off Broadway. Strangely enough, written by Carrie Coon's husband,
Wow.
Tracy.
Tracy Letts, yeah.
And the play is called Killer Joe. And three of my favorite writers that I've ever worked with are Jim Bridges, Tracy Letts, and Damon Lindelof. And for that reason, that whatever they wrote somehow felt like, I don't know what the right way to describe it, channeling myself. So that those scripts, Tracy's on stage every night and would change to some extent every night. Damon's, more powerfully than probably anything I've ever done, played me. So that all I really had to do was not let myself get in the way of what was going to happen, just jump in the water and let it. I'm an open water spear fisherman, among other things. And it's kind of like just jumping in past drop off into the ocean and let the tide take you where it's going to.
Absolutely. If I may, I'd love to talk about The Silence of the Lambs. We just, a year ago, we hit the 25-year mark, and the late Jonathan Demme, when he passed, there was a lot of remembering about that film. For me, that's my favorite film of all time. I was 13 years old when that came out. I'd like to know what you think that the legacy of that film is, given that people still talk about it to this very day.
It was, it's not real easy at this point for me to talk about Jonathan, because I loved him so much. And I'm so, I don't know, such a beautiful person, and so filled with love, and such a great father. I remember in shooting Silence, one of his kids came on the set one day. Most directors would shoo his kid away or And he just stopped the production, picked his kid up and played with him for 15 minutes, and then came back to making the movie. We all, Jody and Anthony, Ted Talley, the guy who wrote it, Jonathan, we all felt like we were making a really good movie. None of us, certainly I had no idea in the world it was going to be that kind of a hit. That year, it was the second highest grossing film of the year, Home Alone being one, and was really successful in countries that don't speak English, and which is almost unheard of. Usually films that translate from one country to the next, or from one culture to another, are like Conan the Barbarian, where people grunt and the storyline goes on like a fable. Silence of the Lambs is very talky, and I, you know, thinking back on it, I think one of the hooks of that film is that we're very used to seeing films about the rites of passage from boyhood to manhood. Very rarely do you see the rites of passage from girlhood to womanhood. And that's really what's going on in Silence of the Lambs. It's the education and passage from being a kid into maturity of Jodie's character. And I think that just resonated wherever it played. That and the fact that Anthony just gave just a motherfucker of a performance.
I know.
And I don't know, I'm still kind of getting over the fact that Jonathan's not here to talk to him.
Yeah, that sucks. It sucks really bad. Scott, I'm so grateful that you gave us your time today. Your career is just, it's so inspiring, and your performance in episode 3 in particular, and throughout the whole season 3, has been so great to watch. We hope and pray that you get some recognition from the Academy perhaps this year. And if you don't, it doesn't matter. It's because they just probably haven't seen it, because it really is quite amazing. And thank you.
Thank you.